Forget the grand portraits and bronze statues. Today we're stripping away the gilded veneer from the name of Sir Martin Frobisher, national hero, admiral, explorer. Because behind that shining legend lies something so shocking, it overturns our understanding of an entire era. Imagine, a man whose name England uttered with reverence turned out to be the central figure, indeed one of the architects, of one of the 16th century's most colossal financial scams. We're talking about a time when the entire country was gripped by a frenzy, an insane, all-consuming hunger for gold, supposedly hidden in the distant lands of the north. Dozens of ships, hundreds of lives, millions of pounds sterling, all were thrown into the bottomless pit of an illusion. And at the head of this pyramid scheme of deceit stood Martin Frobisher, whose expeditions, promising untold riches, were in reality shipping back tons of ordinary, utterly worthless rock. Barren ore, yet it was believed to be gold ore. Capable of enriching the crown and everyone who invested in this mad project. How could a hero, whose name today is associated with unwavering courage? This is not just a story of greed. It's a deep dive into the mechanism of how a myth of easy money can blind an entire nation, how the ambition and perhaps desperation of one man can manipulate the destinies of thousands. We're dissecting this historical wound to understand what forged such a figure, a man who balanced on the edge of genius and swindler, hero and con artist. What shaped his ruthless character, capable of such grand schemes? We've already peeled back the curtain on the grand deception, the audacious farce that transformed Sir Martin Frobisher into a national hero, even though he stood at the epicenter of a financial catastrophe. But to truly grasp the audacity of his designs, to comprehend how a man could orchestrate such a monumental illusion, we must plunge into the crucible where his very soul was forged. This is not just a story of gold and greed, it's a profound exploration into the psychological abyss of a man shaped by trauma, despair, and an unyielding will to survive. Imagine a boy barely out of infancy, torn from the fragile comfort of a newly formed family. Martin Frobisher lost his father early, and that shadow, cast over his formative years, undoubtedly sowed a deep sense of instability and an awareness of life's brutal fragility. It wasn't merely a loss. It was a fundamental jolt that shook his world, forcing him to confront mortality and the necessity of self-reliance, long before his peers. He was sent to live with his great-uncle, Sir John York, a prominent London merchant deeply immersed in the ruthless world of trade and maritime ventures. This was no gentle upbringing. It was an immersion into a sphere where wealth was forged through risk, where fortunes were made and lost on. The open sea, and where ruthlessness was often a prerequisite for success. A child still grappling with the void left by his father was thrust into an environment that valued ambition and resilience above all else. The tender shoots of childhood quickly gave way to a hardened shell of pragmatism. His entry into the unforgiving world of the sea was no romantic journey. It was a baptism by fire. From the age of 14, Frobisher was thrust into the brutal reality of maritime life. Decks were slippery with brine and blood, winds howled with indifferent fury, and every voyage was a gamble against nature, disease, and hostile forces. This was not a gentleman's school. It was a brutal academy where survival was the only curriculum. He learned to navigate not only by the stars but also by the fickle currents of human ambition and betrayal. He witnessed firsthand the randomness of life and death, the everyday cruelty of the era, and the absolute necessity of self-preservation. Every storm weathered, every skirmish survived, etched deeper lines of cynicism and resilience into his young psyche. The sea, in its boundless harshness, became his true father, teaching him lessons no academy ever could: adaptability, cunning, and an unyielding belief in his own capacity to overcome. But it was the crucible of captivity that truly forged his character into the formidable, almost savage instrument he would become. In 1554, barely out of his teens, Frobisher was captured by Portuguese forces off the coast of Guinea. For months, he languished in captivity, a pawn in the brutal geopolitical games of the era. This was not merely an inconvenience. It was an existential threat. He faced starvation, disease, and the constant specter of death or lifelong servitude. This period of forced helplessness, of being entirely at the mercy of his captors, left an indelible mark. It stripped him of any remaining illusions about a benevolent world, replacing them with a grim understanding of power dynamics and the sheer will required for survival. He learned to observe, to wait, to plan, to exploit any weakness, and above all, never again to be vulnerable. His brushes with the law, his stints in English prisons on charges of piracy, these were not mere footnotes in an adventurous career. They were further nails hammered into the coffin of any remaining innocence. Every incarceration, every period of deprivation, reinforced the brutal truth. The world was a cage, and only the most cunning, the most ruthless, the most adaptable would ever truly be free. These experiences, an orphaned childhood, the brutal tutelage of the sea, the horror of captivity, the humiliation of imprisonment, were not disparate incidents. They were a relentless, cumulative assault on the very fabric of his being, shaping him into a man who saw life as an eternal battlefield, where the line between hero and villain blurred into insignificance. He emerged from these trials not merely hardened, but fundamentally transformed. He understood the game, he knew its stakes, and he was prepared to play with a ferocity few could match. He learned that survival often demanded deception, that success was rarely achieved through pure virtue, and that the world rewarded not the righteous, but the bold. This deep psychological scar, this ruthless tempering in the fire of adversity, forged a man for whom moral ambiguities were mere academic exercises. He was a creature of instinct, driven by an almost primal urge not just to survive, but to dominate. His subsequent exploits, his audacious ventures, his willingness to push the boundaries of truth and legality, all were symptoms of this deeply ingrained survival mechanism. He was taught through brutal experience that the world is a place where you either take or are taken, and he resolutely chose to be the one who takes. This internal landscape, carved by trauma and necessity, perfectly prepared him for the grand mystification that lay ahead, a mystification that would redefine his legacy and plunge a nation into a golden illusion. So Martin Frobisher, a man whose biography reads more like a fever dream than an ordinary life, didn't just survive Portuguese captivity and several stints in English prisons. He emerged tempered like steel forged in hell. Every scar, every night behind bars, every deception he endured or perpetrated, only honed his instincts. He was a predator who knew no fear, and his primary lessons were cynicism and the conviction that the world is an arena where not the most righteous, but the most ruthless and cunning, survive. His early years after release from Guinea became a true school of survival in the wild waters of the 16th century. Frobisher didn't just engage in privateering, he turned it into an art form, a bloody ballet on the waves. His name quickly became synonymous with audacity and ruthlessness. He attacked Spanish and Portuguese merchant ships with such ferocity that rumors of him preceded his ships. Nothing was sacred to him, neither the cargo of gold and spices, nor the lives of the crews, nor even international treaties, which were then mere scraps of paper for those who held a sword. He stormed decks, his men with axes and pistols leaving no chance for resistance. Captured ships were either plundered clean or sailed to English ports, where their cargo was divided between desperate cutthroats and their high-ranking patrons. It was here, in this bloody forge of piracy, that Frobisher forged his connections with the English aristocracy. Lords and courtiers, eager for quick money and not above benefiting from others' treasures, saw in him not just a ruffian, but a valuable asset. He was their instrument, their unofficial fleet, capable of striking at the crown's enemies without declaring war. His miraculous releases from prison, and there were several, each time for piracy, were no accident. Behind him stood influential figures to whom he brought fabulous profits. These people pulled him out of the most hopeless situations because he was too valuable to rot in a cell. He was audacious, yet calculating, always knowing when to stop and when to push the boundaries. And he always emerged unscathed, leaving behind only rumors, powder smoke, and mountains of plunder. But Frobisher's true genius, his capacity for monumental mystification, manifested not in plunder, but in the audacious Arctic fraud that shook all of England. This was a game on an entirely different level, not merely seizing others' wealth, but creating an illusion of wealth from nothing, from emptiness, from worthless rock. The plan was simple and audacious in its genius. Find the Northwest Passage to Asia, and along the way, discover untold gold deposits. In 1576, after decades spent in dubious maritime adventures, Frobisher embarked on his first Arctic expedition. He returned not with the passage, but with a sample of black stone, which he claimed was gold ore. And here began an unprecedented spectacle. specially hired experts, alchemists and other charlatans, bought or intimidated, confirmed. Yes, it was gold. Gold fever gripped London and then the entire country. Investors, from Queen Elizabeth I to ordinary artisans, poured in vast fortunes, dreaming of untold riches. Two massive expeditions followed, in 1577 and 1578. These were not mere voyages, but entire flotillas, up to 15 ships, laden with hundreds of people. They sailed into the icy waters of Labrador and Baffin Island, places where nature itself sought to kill anyone who dared to challenge it. Frobisher directed this madness with icy calm. His men, worn out by cold, scurvy, and despair, hacked away at the worthless rock he passed off as gold ore. Tons of this gold were loaded onto ships and brought to England. It was a colossal deception. The London docks were piled high with black stone that, upon closer inspection, turned out to be ordinary iron ore, containing not an ounce of gold. Investors were ruined, their dreams shattered. The country's financial system was shaken. But Frobisher, he emerged unscathed again. His reputation, it seemed, should have been ruined. How could a man who so brazenly defrauded the crown and the entire nation escape the gallows? The answer came from the sea, with the formidable wind that brought the Spanish Armada. In 1588, England faced an existential threat, and it needed not court flatterers, but true fighters. And then, Martin Frobisher stepped onto the stage. The man who had been a pirate, a swindler, and a con artist suddenly became a national hero. His ruthless experience, gained during his years of privateering, his knowledge of naval tactics, his fearlessness in the face of danger, all proved invaluable. In the battle against the invincible Armada, Frobisher proved himself one of the bravest and most skilled commanders. He led a squadron. His ships boldly broke into the formation of Spanish galleons, delivering devastating blows. He was the embodiment of the English spirit, defiant, audacious, and deadly. His cruelty, which once served him in pirate raids, now became a virtue in war. He knew no mercy and expected none. For his services in the defeat of the Armada, he was knighted, becoming Sir Martin Frobisher, a national hero whose name was now stained not by a gold scam, but by the blood of Spaniards. His career didn't end there. He continued to fight Spain, participating in new expeditions, always remaining on the cutting edge of attack, always ready for battle. His luck seemed boundless, his ability to emerge unscathed, supernatural. He was the embodiment of a paradox. A man who built his fortune on deception and plunder became one of his country's greatest defenders. But behind this remarkable ability to reinvent himself, behind this incredible luck and ruthlessness, lay more than just his personal qualities. Behind the scenes, there were always shadows whose interests miraculously aligned with his own, whose hands pulled him from the deepest pits. Who were these invisible puppeteers, and why did they so persistently back a man who was prepared to deceive the entire world? We've seen how Martin Frobisher, this cynical, ruthless architect of the 16th century's greatest scam, miraculously managed to avoid the gallows, prison, and utter oblivion. But miracles, in history as in politics, do not exist. Behind every such miracle lies someone's will, someone's interest, someone's invisible fingers pulling the strings. Behind Frobisher was not just luck. There was an entire network of powerful patrons for whom he was simultaneously an asset, a tool, and a dangerous secret that could not be allowed to be exposed. First in this shadowy gallery of figures was undoubtedly Sir John York, not just a stern guardian who raised a life-hungry predator from an orphaned boy. York was a London merchant, a man with vast connections in the city, in the world of trade, and thus at court. He was the one who introduced the young Frobisher to the world of maritime trade, which soon escalated into privateering and outright piracy. York, without a doubt, benefited from his protégé's early exploits. He was not merely his rescuer from Portuguese captivity, but also likely the puppeteer who exploited Martin's reckless courage for his own, far less romantic, financial dealings. When Frobisher landed in English prisons for piracy, which happened more than once, it was York, with his connections and influence, who pulled him out. This was not charity. It was an investment in a valuable, albeit highly risky, asset. York saw in Frobisher not just a sailor, but a man capable of audacious, profitable, albeit illicit, ventures. Then came Lady Elizabeth Clinton, Countess of Lincoln, an aristocrat whose status and connections were incomparably higher than any merchant's. Why would such an influential lady patronize a disgraced pirate? Perhaps she was drawn to his fierce energy, his audacity, his aura of danger, qualities sorely lacking in the prim and proper world of the court. But more likely, her interest was pragmatic. In an era when wealth and influence were defined by land and political ties, figures like Frobisher became valuable tools for those who sought to expand their horizons, including through maritime plunder, sanctioned or not. She was his guardian angel in the higher echelons, the one who whispered the right words in the right ears when Martin found himself on the brink again. But above them all, like a formidable yet sometimes benevolent goddess, stood Queen Elizabeth I herself. It was her support, her investments in Frobisher's gold fever, that were the cornerstone of this entire grand scheme. Why did she need it? Firstly, the lust for wealth. England, though gaining strength, still lagged behind Spain in financial might. The millions of pounds sterling promised from the northern lands were too tempting a prospect to refuse. Secondly, politics. Frobisher was not just a gold seeker. He was a symbol of English expansion, a challenge to Spanish dominance in the New World. His expeditions, even if they yielded no gold, served as a powerful propaganda tool, demonstrating England's boldness and ambition. Thirdly, control. Dangerous men like Frobisher were better kept close, under scrutiny, their talents used in the crown's interest, rather than allowed to become an uncontrolled threat. And finally, perhaps most importantly, concealing the truth. When it became clear that Frobisher's gold was worthless, the Queen was caught in a trap. Exposing him meant admitting her own colossal mistake, eroding trust in the crown, causing financial chaos, and worst of all, showing weakness in the face of her own subjects and enemies. Therefore, Frobisher had to be saved, his reputation whitewashed, and his energy redirected to new goals. Thus, Frobisher became part of a complex, tacitly existing system, where mutual interests and shared secrets created an almost impenetrable shield. York provided him with financial and business support, Clinton aristocratic cover, and Elizabeth political will and protection. This was not mere favor, but a pact, sealed by millions of lost pounds and hundreds of lives. But even behind this shield, Frobisher was under constant scrutiny. His primary antagonists were not just the Spanish. These were external enemies, convenient for distraction. Far more dangerous were the internal enemies. The defrauded. Investors. The very merchants, nobles, even ordinary townspeople who had invested their savings in Frobisher's gold rush and were left with nothing. Their rage, their ruin, could have exploded the system from within. They had to be appeased, intimidated, bought off. Then there were the exposers of the gold, alchemists, metallurgists, simply shrewd minds who had doubted the Blackstone's authenticity from the start. They were the bearers of an inconvenient truth that could shatter the entire carefully constructed illusion. Their voices were silenced, their expertise ignored, and sometimes, perhaps, they themselves disappeared in a fog of intrigue. And finally, Frobisher's most relentless, most ruthless antagonist was truth itself. That same unflattering reality, that tons of gold ore were common rock, that millions were wasted, that hundreds of people died in the icy waters of the Arctic for a deception. Truth always tried to pursue him, like a shadow, like fate, like inevitable retribution. He ran from it, hid behind new adventures, false heroism, the crown's protection. He was a master of disguise, a virtuoso of deception, but one cannot run from truth forever. For even the most cunning swindler, even the luckiest hero, eventually faces a moment when all his tricks are exhausted and fate presents its final bill. November 1594. Not the roar of the Armada's cannons, not the icy winds of the Arctic, but the filthy, damp reality of a siege. Fort Crozon, Brittany. Spaniards entrenched in the earth, English assaulting their positions. And among them, Sir Martin Frobisher, admiral, hero, national legend, whose name still echoed from London to the farthest seas. A man who had survived captivity, piracy, Arctic hell, and triumph over the world's greatest fleet, found himself on the threshold of his last battle. But not against a fleet, not against the elements, but against a tiny, mundane piece of lead. A musket ball found him in the thigh. Not in the heat of a heroic charge, not in the moment of a decisive duel, but perhaps in the chaos of an ordinary skirmish. A wound that for another would have been a mere annoying setback, for Frobisher turned into a fatal sentence. He was evacuated back to Plymouth, but the journey was long, and the wound treacherously foul. Days turned into weeks. Hope dwindled with each hour, until the body of the great adventurer, accustomed to unimaginable stresses, slowly, agonizingly succumbed to the relentless onset of infection. Gangrene. No heroic ending, no last breath on the deck of a sinking ship. Just a slow, humiliating fading in bed, accompanied by pain and helplessness. Was this the last mistake of the pirate turned admiral, or simply the inevitable consequence of a life lived on the razor's edge? Frobisher, a man who didn't just walk the edge, but danced on it, constantly defying fate, law, and death itself. He survived Portuguese prisons, escaped the gallows for piracy, defrauded the Queen and investors, emerged victorious from the most desperate naval battles. His life was a continuous string of risks, each of which could have been his last. And then, when it seemed he had finally found peace and recognition, fate caught up with him in the most mundane and prosaic way. Not a grand failure, not betrayal, but simply a random bullet and poor medical care. There was a cruel irony in this. A man who built his career on grand illusions and colossal scams was ultimately defeated by the harshest and most undeniable reality: biological death. What passed through his mind in those last days, as fever burned away the remnants of his iron will? Regret? Unlikely. Frobisher was too hardened, too cynical to allow himself such weakness. Did he feel sorrow for the hundreds of lives lost in the icy expanses of the Arctic in pursuit of non-existent gold? Or for the investors whose fortunes he squandered? Most likely, he saw it as merely part of the game, the price to pay for ambition and survival. Perhaps he felt pride, for his knighthood, for the victory over the Armada, for the fact that he, a simple sailor, had reached such heights, outwitting even the Queen herself. Or perhaps, in his eyes, there was only defiance, a final stubborn resistance to the inevitable, the familiar expression of a man who never gave up. He knew that his life was a patchwork quilt of brilliant victories and dirty secrets, heroism and deceit, and perhaps, in his last moments, he simply accepted his fate, as he would have accepted another storm or enemy fire, with the same cold determination. For a man who balanced on the edge his entire life, death was merely the final, inevitable payment for a lifelong game with fire. And his departure, so mundane and unheroic, became a final, silent commentary on the very essence of his existence, on that fine, blurred line between great accomplishment and unprincipled deception. We have traced Martin Frobisher's path from unprincipled privateer to national hero, from a con artist who devoured a nation's fortune to a knight who saved England. But in this story, as in many others, lies something far greater than just one man's biography. It is a profound dissection of human nature itself, its bottomless ambitions, and that slippery morality that allows us to balance on the edge of greatness and baseness, justifying the most questionable actions in the name of higher, or seemingly, higher, goals. The main lesson Frobisher imparts to us from the depths of the 16th century lies in the striking flexibility of ethical norms when power, untold wealth, or the salvation of national interests are at stake. His story is not just a chronicle of a grand deception. It is a masterclass in survival and ruthless adaptation in a world where reputation is often secondary to the outcome. Frobisher was a liar, but he was a useful liar, sometimes even a genius. He was a swindler, but his swindling, paradoxically, ultimately served the crown, albeit indirectly, through the tempering of his character and the acquisition of invaluable experience that proved useful at a crucial moment. The system that spawned him, used him, and then protected him from retribution, consciously or unconsciously, accepted this Faustian bargain. And have we truly come far from this, in our seemingly enlightened 21st century? Look at modernity. Do we not see the same patterns, only in different, more sophisticated guises? Grandiose financial pyramids promising untold riches from thin air, where new investors finance old ones until the entire structure collapses, leaving behind ruins and disillusionment. The digital gold rushes of recent years, based on naked speculation and rampant hype, where millions, even billions, vanish overnight, destroying lives and dreams? How many modern geniuses and visionaries, elevated to